Well, I'm here with Lissy, and we've really enjoyed having you with us today, and just want to say thank you so much for pouring into our churches and students through the main session talk and also the breakouts. And this morning, you introduced this idea of who we are at home is who we really are. So would you mind just to kind of unpack that a little bit and even kind of some of your journey of realizing that?
Yeah, absolutely. So really it kind of all started for me when I was in high school. And kind of as I mentioned before, I grew up in a Christian home. My dad was a pastor. And I was always like the good kid. Like I, wasn't rebellious. I was pretty obedient, a little strong-willed at times. But like for the most part, I did what I was told. And I would always have like kind of in my outside life with my friends and with my teachers, they'd always be like, oh, Lissy, like, you're so amazing, like, you're so mature, you're so wise, you're so great. And I was kind of like, yeah, I am all those things. And at home, my parents were like, okay, Lissy, like, you were really rude to your sister the other day. Like, you haven't been very responsible with, like, your jobs around here. Like, we think you're a little self-absorbed right now. Like, you need to work on this, this, and this. And I got to this point of frustration where I was like, oh my goodness, Mom and Dad, like everyone else is just constantly telling me how great I am. Why can't you guys just hop on the bandwagon and agree for once?
Right.
And it took until my senior year of high school where God really brought me to a place of vulnerability. And this phrase just kept coming to my mind of who you are at home is who you really are. And who I was at home was the real me. And all of my selfishness and rudeness to my family in my high school, that was who I was. It wasn't the person at church or at school or with my friends.
Right.
And my family, who loves me the most, gets the absolute worst of my personality. And so that growth to become more like Christ, that practical action step of living out our faith, it starts first in our hearts, but then it starts with the people that God has put closest to us, and that would be our families.
Yeah, that's great. And this week we've been talking about what it means to be a stranger and an exile. And so if we follow Jesus faithfully and come to him on his terms and do what he said, deny ourselves, take up our cross and follow him, our lives are going to look in a very different trajectory. And what you're talking about looks very different than the world.
Yeah.
To prioritize home and who we are at home, and even social media has made kind of this world where we project the image of who we are, but we can't do that at home. Like we are who we are at home, and it really does bring that mirror. So during your talk, you kind of walked us through 4 biblical principles that are really just practical. If you want to live for God at home, if you want to follow Jesus in this environment, here are 4 things that really need to be present. So could you just take a couple minutes and just walk us through those 4 things?
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of the first of those 4 things, the first virtue is honor. And really where God began to convict me of this virtue of honor is the difference between honor and obedience. And in the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20:12, it says, honor your father and mother so that you may live long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. And, for the longest time, I was always like, okay, I'm an obedient kid. Like, I do what I'm told. Like, all right, I've got this commandment down. Like, moving on, don't need to work on it. Like, let's get to something a little bit more challenging. And I got to this point where I was like, in the 10 Commandments, God doesn't just say, obey your parents. Like, we're called to honor them. And honor combines our actions and our attitude. And so you can have obedience with a dishonoring heart behind it. And that's not what we're called to do. And so really where God began to shape me and mold me was just asking myself the question, do I hold my parents in high respect? Do I hold my parents in high regard? And oftentimes the answer was no, because the attitude of my heart was one of anger and bitterness and defiance towards them. And so it was really just humbly asking God, okay, God, give me a heart that is able to honor my parents, even when it's hard, even when I don't want to, that goes beyond just obedience.
That's good. So walk us through the other one. So honor, what comes next?
So the next one we talked about is love. And the verse that we talked about was, kind of the greatest commandment in the Bible. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And the second is this, to love your neighbor as yourself. And that command becomes really difficult when we're talking about really our sibling relationships at home and how that practically plays out. And we talked a little bit about how, that term, brothers and sisters in Christ, it's really a positive term in Christian circles. Like, we use it so interchangeably, and it's such a positive thing. But if we actually applied it to, okay, what if I actually treated you the way I treated my brothers at home?
Right.
What if I actually treated you the way I treated my sisters? And, all of a sudden that phrase doesn't become as positive anymore, because if we all treated each other the way we treated our siblings, it would be a mess. Right. It would be awful. And so that practical step of what does it look like to love your neighbor? Well, it starts with, our God-given best friends that are in our homes. And so really the two steps that I've found that have just really shaped and formed my friendship with my siblings is just forgiveness and then prayer. And so, we have to become experts at forgiveness in our families because those hurts can build up so quickly and so easily. So we need to become really good at apologizing and forgiving. And then the second one is just prayer. We have these spiritual friendships with, our friends. We share prayer requests, but, oftentimes siblings can go their whole lives and never pray together.
Yeah.
And so for teenagers especially, it's such a unique time of life because we can build that spiritual friendship with our siblings while we're both still at home. And that friendship can then last into adulthood. That's
good. And it makes me think about, in Luke 10, I think it is, when Jesus gets asked that question, who's my neighbor? And he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, who's the least likely person anyone would expect to be the neighbor. And to your point, your neighbor isn't just the person who lives next door, or not just the person that is easy to get along with. Our neighbors is anyone that God's placed in our path, and that begins at home. So honor, action and attitude, love. What's the third one?
Service. So we talked about this idea of servant leadership. And for me, growing up, I was involved in all these leadership groups and service groups and went on mission trips. And I had a heart that was so happy to serve everywhere else, but when it came to service in my own home, I was like, whoa, no.
Too much.
Not my job, not my responsibility. I'm like, this is my place. I'm not trying to go past what I'm required to do here.
Sure.
And so the verse that God really put on my heart was Galatians 5:13, and it talks about, serving one another humbly in love. So what does that look like practically for our families is, it can be really difficult to put ourselves in a position of service, especially when there's no recognition.
That's right.
And I remember, wanting to, I was doing the dishes, and I just did it, and no one asked me to do it. I was like, oh, this would be so great. I'm such a servant. And no one even noticed. My mom didn't say anything. My dad didn't say anything. They were all just going about their business. And I was so angry, and I was so upset, and so just, on my self-righteous little pedestal of, I can't believe they didn't, affirm me for serving them.
Yeah.
But that's not serving one another humbly in love. And so something really practical is seeking out ways in which to serve your family, knowing that you're not going to get any recognition for it. And realizing that, that's kind of what it looks like to lead by service.
Yeah, that's great. And again, Jesus talked about that. I am among you and the one who serves. You've seen the Gentiles, you've seen the people with power, how they lord it over. I've come to serve, not to be served, but to serve. And even in the section of the Lord's Prayer, Jesus talks about, don't do this in front of men. If you do it, you'll get your reward. Do it in secret so that your Father can honor you. And so I love that. So honor, love, service. What's the last one?
So the last one we talked about was honesty. And, this is really hard. And this is hard for me still to this day. We talked about this verse in Proverbs that says, my son, give me your heart. And so, in my family growing up, we talked about the heart connection relationship between parent and child. And a heart connection relationship is one that's full of warmth and openness and honesty and trust. And I really do believe that there is this intense spiritual attack that comes against the relationship between parents and kids, because Satan and the demons want to do everything in their power to keep parents' hearts far away from their kids and kids' hearts far away from their parents. And so for teenagers, sharing our lives with our parents, sharing what's going on with our friends, or spiritually, or struggles that we're having, it is so difficult. And it sometimes doesn't even make sense why it's so difficult. But I think that practice of honesty and saying, okay, I'm going to recognize that my parents, God gave me to my parents as they're my spiritual authority. And like by sharing my heart with them, by sharing what's going on in my life, I'm opening myself up to their love and to their discipleship and to their wisdom. And so while that's so hard to do, I think practically it can be as small as like, you tell your parents how a day at school was, or maybe some drama that's going on with your friends, or maybe you don't want to go to church, and talking to them about that. And so those small steps of building that trust and honesty and openness with your parents, I think can so dramatically change the relationship.
And it can be as simple, like you're saying, of instead of just not having the conversation or giving the one-word answer, like trying to create that dialogue. And I love the way you put it about how the enemy wants to turn parents away from children, turn children away from parents, because that's true. And in the Old Testament, that's kind of how it ends, with this promise that God is going to turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, hearts of the children to their fathers. So whenever that's not happening, we know it's not coming from the Father.
Right.
And that God's called us to unite in that. So thank you so much for investing in us this weekend, and we're just praying that these truths begin to cultivate in the hearts of the teenagers and leaders who are here. And I love the message, because I really do think if we do begin to live the gospel at home, that's going to look countercultural. That's going to stand out. That's going to be a stranger and an exile. It's going to look really different. And as you're talking about it, it just makes me think about even Jesus himself. I love 1 Corinthians 15, and in that passage it talks about all the people that Jesus appeared to before he ascended to heaven. And one of the people that he intentionally went to was James, his brother. So you go back in Luke 10 and 11, and Jesus' brothers didn't believe in him. They didn't believe he was God. But between resurrection and ascension, of all the people Jesus could have talked to, he went back after his brother, and James became a believer and a leader of the church. And so if Jesus prioritized family, we should.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
No, thanks for having me.
So, Lissy, just tell us, just kind of in conclusion, first, thank you for coming and being a part. But you tell us, like, how can people connect with you, find out more about you, and just some of the resources you've put together?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually have a devotional that I wrote a couple of years ago. It's called Living for Christ at Home. And it's really short, but it just walks through those 4 virtues and gives some scriptures and some really practical application steps of how we can live this out at home. And so that devotional is actually a free download on our website. So the website is www.visionaryfam.com, and it should be right on there when you go to that website. The other resource that we have is I published a book this past summer that's called The Heart of Your Teen, and it's actually a book for parents that kind of just gives sort of a window into the mind of their teenager or their middle schooler, of just saying like, okay, how can I build a relationship with my child, and how can we preserve our relationship while walking through some really difficult issues that parents and teens face kind of as teenagers are growing up and entering into adulthood. And that's also on that same website. And then another way to connect with me is just on Instagram. My Instagram is Liss, Liss_Rienow, Rienow, and I would love to connect with you and talk to you more.
Thank you so much, Lissy, and definitely check her stuff out. And we just hope that this video helps you continue the conversation of how you live out your faith at home.